Revelation 12 focuses on the body. The body's reactions to everyday experiences. New forces at a deeper level in man. What must be remembered in our journey toward becoming the Son of Man? Jesus said, "But the Comforter, which is the Holy Ghost, whom the Father will send in my name, he shall teach you all things, and bring all things to your remembrance, whatsoever I have said unto you." The Comforter will assist us in our remembering. The readings paraphrases the idea this way. I will bring to your remembrance all things, from the foundations of the world. In adding to some of those things as have been applied, let each consider how and why that such application would be made by John the Beloved in a message of the nature and character. First, the body of the Christ represented to the world a channel, a door, a mediation to the Father. This then may become as the study of self in its relationship to the material world, the mental world, the spiritual world. This is the manner that has been presented as the way through which each individual would make application of the life of the Christ in his or her own experience. We must do as Jesus did and follow his teachings. We must become a son, one with him. Revelation 12 reveals what happened in the beginning, when the souls rebelled in heaven, and their rebellion carried on in the earth plane. All these memories are necessary to be remembered for the soul to recognize the way back to God. For the soul does not forget. Revelation 12 begins the explanation, via memory, of why we need to understand the body and its functions. The memories presented here are recalled in the order needed to meet particular circumstances and not in sequential order as recorded on movie-type film.
And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars.
Revelation is written in symbolic language. Heaven means consciousness. The outside world would not exist to a soul, if not for a consciousness of it. The outside world brings awareness to us. We would know nothing of the self except the way of the vibrations which reach us from the outside world. Revelation 12 considers the universal forces and their relationships to us. The great wonder in heaven is the mystical and universal natures of man and the earth. Why we are on earth must be revealed, remembered. The woman clothed with the sun is the whole earth plane in which all the planets as planes of consciousness are clothed with the influences in the sun, its forces and radiations, as well as the gravitational and other forces symbolized by the planets as planes of consciousness experienced between earth incarnations. We do not incarnate into bodies but into influences. Each and every soul entity or earthly entity passing through the Earth's plane radiates in that plane those conditions that are radiated from the soul or spiritual entity in the individual. Then we only reach those radiations left in Earth's plane that are taken again when entering in Earth's plane, whether entity is conscious of same or not. The consciousness of reaching that condition wherein the physical body may take up that truth known must be reached by all. We reincarnate into our own influences as we move once again into the Earth's plane of consciousness. In other words, we never die but move between the various planes of consciousness, dimensions, in our solar system. Hence life is continuous, as are the influences we become aware of when we reach that state, wherein the physical body may take up, remember, that truth known. The woman clothed with the sun is a universal symbol of motherhood. We are dealing with the birth processes of the various consciousnesses in the earth plane, not just the conscious mind in the earth. The planetary consciousness are brought to the earth plane as urges or inclinations. When we look at the many variations in the dimensions of consciousness among the planetary influences, one can see that the total birthing process is of universal importance, for the earth plane is the testing portion of the universal vibration. The earth and its functions has often been referred to as Mother Earth. In the greater universal forces the earth plane is the great mother whereupon the sun, the planets and all their forces enact a creative dance as their own separate forms and yet are part of the greater systems found in our galaxy. This woman with the moon under her feet presents us with The principle of reflection as moon reflecting the sun. A most basic principle, or law, that controls us all to such an extent that it is generally not regarded as a law. Reflection is a law or principle activity of consciousness which allows, or causes, us to remember anything whatsoever. It is the very foundation of all we learn or remember, because it involves the total operation of mind, even the why of mind itself. It involves knowing, and knowing apparently involves reflection and reasoning. This woman standing on the moon speaks much for the intuitive nature of man. The looking into the self. Interestingly, the moon affects us day and night, just as it does the tides and other biological systems in us which are just beginning to be known and seriously studied. The phrase regarding what the woman had upon her head, a crown of 12 stars, appears to relate to a way of thinking. This woman relates to her activity in the total solar system, the feminine principle, mother. The 12 stars represents the 12 signs of the zodiac. The 12 stars also represent the 12 senses in the body, 5 physical senses, sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, plus 7 sensing qualities inherent in the operation of the endocrine system, which are associated with the 7 planetary influences. The 12 stars also represent the 12 tribes of Israel, as well as the force behind the choosing of the 12 disciples. The 12 is also associated with the senses as we work through time, space and patience to arrive at the 144,000 spiritualized cells in the body. A factor we shall meet again.
And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth, and pained to be delivered.
She, being with child, represents the solar system as a place for souls to test their use of free will. The solar system, the model of which is the body itself, was populated by the projection of man as a place where soul could be born again out of the darkness caused by the choice to use self-will. All souls manifested in flesh in the earth's plane went through the death of their true nature as sons of God, hence they must be born again or resurrected from the first death. This was referred to by Jesus when he told Nicodemus, "Except a man be born again, he cannot see the kingdom of God." And Jesus further said, "That which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit." One may be born of the Spirit, but it is a process exemplified in the birth of the Son of Man. The process of giving birth to the Son of Man and the pangs of such birthing trauma are the trials and tribulations arising from the application of the Word of God as a creative effort as given by Jesus. For man in the earth involves the memory of his use of will even from when he started. Will is the basis of man's being in the earth and continues to be so, for it is at the core of all his conflicts and keeps him separated from the creative forces. Man meets his own use of will in his application of the Word of God, so long as he holds to this supposed freedom. Man has forgotten that his use of free will relates to his use of mind. He was not given a free mind as a thing separate and apart from God's mind as is his free will. Mind was, and still is, the very essence of the being of the soul, even before it was given free will, for it was made in the image and likeness of God himself. Once man used his will to rebel, he in effect was, and still is, following in the footsteps of the leader of that rebellion, Satan, who created a kingdom of his own. Man, as soul, brought this effect to earth where he became entangled in the flesh by reason of the use of his creative powers. On earth these creative powers were used to create in him a self-identity which he claimed and is a thing separate from God's creation. His fall was from one state of consciousness into another. Man was caught up in his own creations, which are in mind the creator of his own concepts. For all is mind. Thus man became two minds. The most important one for man was where his creative focus was, and this became the physical conscious mind, a thing separate and apart from the mind, subconscious, which was the essence of himself. He, in mind, separated himself from his creator by creating his own world of being. Hence he forgot that mind, subconscious, is of the soul. In that unconsciousness he will find his separation from his creator. It is thus that man's use of will is in direct opposition to the mind forces in himself. This is the basis of his trials and tribulations arising from the use of his own creative efforts in the physical world, which are for self's gratification as a creator. This is shown in the readings, wherein we may notice the separations relating to consciousness and the use of will. We have the mind of the spirit consciousness, of the physical subconscious or soul. We have the mind of the physical body, through which any or all of these may manifest. The will is that active principle against which such manifestations respond. Hence it is in direct opposition to mind action. This, we find then, refers to the condition in the material world, will, see. The will in the spirit plane or spirit consciousness, not spirit entity, being the creation of that manifested in the earth plane. Hence the different conditions in will's manifesting and in how will is in opposition to the mind force. In this reading there appears to be three separate minds, yet they are said to act as one. The mind of the spiritual entity, that mind wherein the entity, spiritual entity we are speaking of, manifests in the spiritual plane. The mind of the soul in the physical body is the subconscious, the physical conscious through which the entity manifests in the physical world, one in all in one. For knowledge comes through the senses in the physical body to the physical conscious mind. The subconscious has the storing of the knowledge of given conditions, then the physical consciousness receives through the senses that knowledge, the will is the action against the incentive set forth. Here again we seemingly have three minds, yet they are all one mind, but the will is the action against the incentive set forth. And this seems to mean that the will is in opposition to the spiritual essence in the knowledge coming to an individual, for the spirit is of God's will, what we need. Whereas our will is focused on what we want, hence the opposition to mind force. Let us look at a particular sentence again in the first portion of this reading quoted above. The will in the spirit plane or spirit consciousness, not spirit entity, being the creation of that manifested in the earth plane. In this we can see that the real battle of wills goes on, which we recognize as the battle of our will against God's will. This battle of wills is that great battle of Armageddon, found later in Revelation 16 verse 16. When we look at the operation of mind and will, the spirit, purpose, of the earth plane is opposed by self's will. We see that the full forge of the solar system is involved in the birth trauma being experienced by the woman in her efforts to bring into being, a birthing of, a projection of man and spirit into the earth plane. Earth is a place for man to shed his desire to use his free will and, by becoming one with the creative forces, be born of the spirit in the earth plane, the spirit of for others. Exemplified by God in the beginning. As he follows the pattern set by the Son of Man, Jesus, who in turn became the Christ, the Savior of the world.
And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads.
An insight into the dragon, woman and child is gained from the readings. In Revelation 12 we find the symbols of the woman, dragon and child. Do these represent the part played by souls in the creation and fall of man? Please explain the reference of these symbols. Rather to show to the individual entity that from which the soul in the earth has passed in its creation, its activity in the earthly sojourn, see. For as we go on or interpret further we find. The war was in heaven, see. The woman. Or the mother. Earth, the source from which all materiality is to become a conscious thing. And these are brought forth. Now ye have reached to that understanding of thy perfection with God, how in materiality ye may attune the attributes of self. Now from what have ye arisen? These are emblems, significant of that is given as the name of Satan, the devil, the dragon or the like, through which man's rebellious forces arise, even though he has attained to the book even itself in his body. And these are the experiences then to be met. This quote tells us a great deal about our involvement in the earth, our beginnings, as well as pointing to the fact that even though we are aware of the book in our body, we yet have to meet the experiences as presented in Revelation 11. In previous chapters we were shown how the Son of Man had come to understand and overcome the body forces, but there remained the total self of the entity, the experiences to be met. This entails remembering all the spiritual aspects taken by the soul in its journey through all the earth planes and realms of self's actions since and before his first death. The loss of consciousness of being one with God and his Son. Man brought with him into the earth plane an inclination to allow self-will, or rebellion, to work through him. Satan was the leader of such forces before the earth plane was set aside for man's redemption. The great red dragon is the spirit of rebellion brought by man as he came into this plane. He had experienced it before entering. For a further understanding of how Satan may influence man, one should read carefully the first 2 chapters of Job and note his presenting himself before the Lord, Job 1 verse 6 and 2 verse 1, as well as the Cayce readings on prehistory. The dragon had 7 heads, which means the 7 ways man is influenced through the endocrine system, the doorways through which the planetary forces work. Man could rebel against these planetary influences, for they are the universal creative functions available for man's use, as is the force of rebellion. The 10 horns are the vibrations of the rebellious forces. The dragon's 7 crowns indicate that the stimulation of the rebellious vibratory forces was the only way he could influence man, for man has free will to choose or reject these influences. With the choices being activated in the body at the light-incarnate level of creativity, it is plain that the rebellious choices would carry through whatever form of idea presented to consciousness as being of the self. Hence we can become devils or saints according to the choices of how we attune the attributes of self through these horns. The vibrations.
And his tail drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born.
And the dragon drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven and did cast them to earth. This may have been a rebellious act. But before we make such a judgment, refer again to Job 1 verse 12 and 2 verse 6 for the Lord's 2 charges to Satan about his torment of Job. And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, all that he hath is in thy power, only upon himself put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. And the Lord said unto Satan, Behold, he is in thine hand, but save his life. In the context presented there we must at least consider Satan as a servant of God, which in the light of the total story of man, as well as a revelation to him, shows the magnanimous nature of God as recorded in John 3:16. For God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. In Job 2:1 Satan presented himself before the Lord. Surely Satan believed. And will he too not eventually be saved from self? Just as we? This is a question which we must look at before we can arrive at a new heaven, a new consciousness. For instance, is it possible that Satan was not carrying out the wishes of God as recorded in Job, and did not until God said, Behold, he is in thine hand, but save his life? And the Lord said unto Satan, Whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord, and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. The questions we raise about our beliefs encourage possibly the greatest study of the revelation, for they involve the study of the self. Since Satan drew the 3rd part of the stars to earth, we should look at this reading, also included under Revelation 8. 1/3 part of sun smitten and 1/3 of stars. These are symbolical and represent in the experience of the individual that of life and heat, beauty, and that is given in another portion. The stars declare the glory of God, the firmament showeth his handiwork. These then represent in the experiences the vibrations of the emotions that are being aroused. Again less and less then is it of self, and more unto the glory of the Father. The satanic vibrations certainly take over, or manifest through the vibrations involved in the emotions. We should remember that vibrations are composed of spirit or energy, ideas and purposes. It would appear the satanic influence brought to earth the idea of rebellion. Hence the third part of the vibration affecting us relates to the use of our will and purposes in those ideas, stars, coming to us from consciousness, heaven. The dragon standing before the woman means that the idea of rebellion confronts all flesh in the earth plane as a possibility, for man took on flesh and, as mentioned heretofore, owes a debt to the flesh. The dragon was before the earth plane, the development principle is symbolized by the woman ready to deliver the man-child. Her efforts were intended to bring forth the Son of Man, which includes all souls in the earth plane. And Satan was there to devour the child and self's rebellious natures. For further observations on the woman and child refer to comments under verse 3 above as well as the following. What is meant by the symbol of the child in Revelation 12? That which the outgrowth of the application of the word or the book upon self. For as the child it is born of application of the elements in the body, physical, mental and spiritual, of the individual. From this reading we may well notice that the child results from our own application of the word, that given to us as we create in ourselves the responses desired. By use of the elements earth, water, air and fire, which are our earthly fleshly natures, we produce the various stances or attitudes we assume by our application of the creative word, whether in the physical body, the mental body or the spiritual body. This means, of course, that what we do in the earth goes with us as a part of the soul throughout the earth plane. It would be well to recall that the soul develops only in the earth plane. In the following quotes from the readings we find a view of man in the earth, which helps us to understand the present verse in the larger context of the total revelation. In the beginning, as matter was impregnated with spirit of the creative influence, there came into being man in his environment that made for the indwelling of the spirit, with the soul that might be made one with that creative energy. That matter became impregnated with spirit arose from the very fact that spirit, separated, had erred, and only through the environ of matter, of flesh, might the attributes of the source of good be manifested. In this we find that the flesh itself is a creative influence to the very nature of man, for it is impregnated with the creative influence by reason of which man may, with the soul, become one with that creative influence or the creative word. In the first cause or principle, all is perfect. In the creation of soul, we find the portion may become a living soul free-willed and equal with the Creator. To reach that position, when separated, must pass through all stages of development, that it may be one with the Creator. As we have is this. Man. In the beginning, we find the spirit existent in all living force. In that of creation of man, we find all the elements in a living, moving, world, or an element in itself, yet without that experience as of a first cause, yet endowed with all the various modifications of elements or forces manifested in each. For first there is the spirit, then soul, man we are speaking of, then mind with its various modifications and with its various incentives, with its various ramifications, if you please, and the will the balance and the force that may make all or lose all. In the developing of the soul, then, that the man may be one with the Father, necessary that the soul pass, with its companion the will, through all the various stages of development, until the will is lost in him, and he becomes one with the Father. In the illustration of this, we find in the man is called Jesus. In this man, as man, makes his will the will of the Father, then becoming one with the Father and the model for man. As to the soul itself and its own part through evolution. We have the soul as the body of the spiritual force manifested in the individual, as we find in every body animated with the ability to reproduce in self a thing separate from the rest of the world, yet depending upon the material world for sustenance, the same as we have in the soul, as given and separate entity, the dwelling or indwelling in man, is that dependence upon the attributes of the body that it possesses for that necessary for its development. Hence the conditions as regard its developing, depending both upon the environment and upon the hereditary conditions, considered from the physical only. Hence the relative attraction for conditions of the soul for that necessary development of that soul from entity to entity, whether material or spiritual. In these quotes we find that the developing entity must meet itself and what it has become in its journey throughout the various planes of consciousness, but we must consider the soul in the earth itself, as in this. The plane of man refers to the soul and spirit, forming the entity in a human physical body in a material world. For the attributes of the physical makeup are but the test of the soul's environment and for its awakening or its development, that it, the soul, may partake of those conditions necessary to develop into such an one as Jesus manifested in the flesh. And again the readings distinguish the varying developments in relation to the spirit and soul, or spirit entity. The spirit entity is only the portion that develops other than in Earth's plane. Spirit entity. For soul's development is in the Earth's plane. The spirit entity is in the spirit plane. A close reading of these quotes should help us to recognize the importance of the birthing of the Son of Man, as pictured in the above verse. Yet the focus has necessarily been upon the results of the birth and its developments which we shall meet again.
And she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up unto God and to his throne.
The solar system, the woman which we equate with the acceptance principle, produced, brought forth, by reason of the creative forces, a man-child. We should recall the total evolutionary process set forth under the preceding verse. The overcoming of all planes of consciousness. This process could not work properly, except that the man-child accepted the use of, and purposes in the creative forces. It should be quite clear that the man-child mentioned is the same we know as the Son of Man. That this man-child was to rule all nations with a rod of iron does not relate to the ruling of the nations of the earth, for Jesus himself said, "My kingdom is not of this world." It does seem to mean that he would be the one to rule the flesh body, which is composed of nations of cells of memory, and rule the reactions of the body, by becoming one with the creative forces impregnated in living matter, and by making his will one with God's will. The rod of iron implies the strength of resisting temptation and or holding fast to the purpose of returning to the Father. Her child was caught up unto God does not mean that he was taken up to God as was Elijah. This child was caught up in the spirit of being a savior of man, which was foreordained even from the beginning, for he was that one referred to as the first Son of God. He is the one referred to when God said, "Let us make man." He was caught up in the work of the creative forces as they developed him into man who would be the model for all. It is small wonder that he said, "I and my Father are one." For he had become one with the Creator's forces through the plane of man, as he met the tests of the soul's environment. He had awakened the soul which would partake of these conditions necessary to develop into one such as Jesus, manifested in the flesh. Being caught up unto God and his throne, clearly references the seat of God himself in man, not outside man. The seat of the creative forces in the body. This further means that the child was caught up to a consciousness of the meaning behind the creative forces. This we place outside our normal understanding, for it is joined with the superconsciousness and is that part of each of us. Of the soul. Which never left God, except that we forgot. This throne is the remembrance of the seat of God in us. Here the words do not mean much to us, for we can only think in three-dimensional terms, hence the term throne is used properly.
And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she hath a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days.
Revelation 12:6 indicates that as soon as the woman gave birth to the child she fled into the wilderness, found refuge for 1,260 days, and was fed by a they, which is unknown. But in Revelation 12 verses 13 through 16 the woman was persecuted by the dragon and had to be rescued by being given wings of an eagle. We mentioned this order of presentation to show the inconsistency of the recorded happenings as sequential. The woman fleeing into the wilderness seems a straightforward event in itself, but we must look at the whole chapter in light of the universal forces found in man, which are also helping or hindering him in his efforts to know himself and to return to the Father. The woman. The solar system. fled away, so to speak, from out of our galaxy, so that she is now far out along an arm of the galaxy. This idea has nothing to do with the fleeing into the wilderness. It is, however, symbolic of man forgetting or going away from his maker. Upon the first death occurrence, when man forgot, he was so entranced with his own activities that he became very confused. He had to learn to make do on his own, and this brought confusion to the earth plane itself. In that of creation of man, we find all the elements of a living, moving world, or an element in itself. In this light man created the element of confusion, for in his forgetting, he was without that experience of a first cause. Hence a wilderness came into being wherein the acceptance principle itself seemed a state of confusion, and man was confronted with the unknowns arising from Satan's influences, which stood before the woman. This brought the feeling of confusion on the part of the forces of acceptance in the earth plane. The woman. This confusion arises because the woman, the earth plane, had taken on the job of producing a son who would eventually return to the father. Into this plane there was introduced an unholy mixture of minds in man, as we know him, and she had to deal with these influences which were unnatural in her. A more detailed explanation of this is found in Revelation 13. In this confusion, however, she was to be fed and given a way of escape, so to speak, as found in verse 14 below. A place prepared of God does not mean prepared by God. It is a place, a state of consciousness, that became or came into being as a result of man's forgetting his source as an experience as of a first cause, yet endowed with all the various modifications of elements or forces manifested in each. Certainly this statement presents a state of confusion in man. A wilderness of unconsciousness. The 1260 days is a time element. From the reading's standpoint we can see that there is much agreement as to the meaning of the numbers. The 1 is a symbol of the beginning, and all activities emanate from the 1. The 2 is the symbol of duality, yet makes for weakness. The 3 indicates the strength as seen in the Godhead, thus symbolizes spiritual synthesis, and is concerned with the basic principles of unity of body, mind and spirit. The 6 makes for beauty and the symmetrical forces of all numbers, making for strength. Thus the 1260 represents the coming together of the separation in man, through the perfection reached in the cycles indicated by the 0. Also we should not overlook the same number sequence in relation to the witnesses in Revelation 11:3 above. Both are in the framework of evolutionary processes. We have not overlooked the phrase they should feed her refers to the spirit of the life force in all living matter, which is that which keeps alive all flesh and fulfills the concept only through the environs of matter, of flesh might the attributes of the course of good be manifested. Simply stated this means that the vibrations of the life force should sustain the development or evolution back to the beginning by feeding the acceptance, or female, principle. We might also refer the sum of the numbers to the period of gestation, 9 months, in bringing to full term the development of the solar system's ability to produce a son. It can also relate to the gestation period of the child through which man is prepared to be born as a son of man. It seems that the readings give ample evidence of the theory of evolution. Consider that, whether it is mineral, vegetable or animal, these are spiritualized in that ability of using, doing, being all that the Creator had given them to do. Hence man was given that which is not a part of mineral, vegetable or animal kingdoms, though man, by man, is considered of the animal kingdom. Will. With the environmental forces and the spiritual negative in the serpent. Acceded to desire, to become and to experience in that kingdom of influence. This brought the acceptance, by man's own will.
And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels.
The war was in heaven, see. The woman. Or the mother. Earth, the source from which all materiality is to become a conscious thing. And these are brought forth. These are emblems, significant of that is given as the name of Satan, the devil, the dragon or the like, through which man's rebellious forces arise, even though he has attained to the book even itself in his body. And these are the experiences then to be met. What is meant here by the war in heaven between Michael and the devil? As has just been given, as is understood by those here, there is first, as is the spiritual concept. The spiritual rebellion, before it takes mental or physical form. This warring is illustrated there by the war between the Lord of the Way and the Lord of Darkness, or the Lord of Rebellion. In light of this reading and considering Satan to be of the rebellious forces that arise in man as experiences to be met, we suggest a careful reading of Revelation 11:7, 12:17, 13:4, 13:7, 19:11 and 19:19, for they all have to do with the consciousness in us. All these verses relate to what is going on within us, not a devil as an entity, and, when considered as a psychological inner warring of reactions, the passages seem more than just personal reactions. They have a universal meaning, for these warrings existed before the earth plane was set up as a dwelling place for man. In view of this universal warring in us, the verse itself seems quite clear when we consider that heaven is a state of consciousness, and the rebellions are an expression of such going on in us. These memories regarding the pre-earth, or universal forces as experiences of learning and bearing on the daily activities of man in the earth, unfold as we proceed.
And prevailed not, neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceiveth the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him.
It appears that after the war in heaven, which Satan and his angels lost, he was cast out into the earth. Simply put, this verse says that only in earth activities can Satan now be found. We should remember that Satan, the Lord of rebellion and spirit, can influence us all. And we should not overlook the fact that his influence is apparently limited to Earth's plane. Also, we should study the story of Job closely, for there, again, we get a different picture of Satan than is usually painted.
And I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, Now is come salvation and strength, and the kingdom of our God, and the power of his Christ. For the accuser of our brethren is cast down, which accused them before our God day and night.
The loud voice is related to a universal vibration, not to a personality, which could easily be a principle of consciousness, and possibly the spirit of for others, because consciousness, heaven, is free from Satan's direct influence. However, we carry his influence into our consciousness. This seems reasonable in that the next words are now is come salvation. Certainly salvation refers to the Christ activity, the saving factor in us, especially as we accept Jesus's teachings and make them our life. With such acceptance there comes, as in Jupiter, strength to the activity of the pituitary gland, which is the master, the controlling force of the body. This action, the voice, is at the opposite end of the silver cord in the body, which connects the Leiden activity with the pineal, the gonads being the seat of the influences in our desires. The kingdom of our God equate with the consciousness which appears to be uninhibited by the separation from the comprehensions. The brain seems to be oriented to the wholeness or universal natures of relationships. This would more aptly parallel the kingdom of God than the separative concepts attributable to the brain's awareness. The power of his Christ is the saving of self from the separation aspects in consciousness, caused by our forgetting our source of being. Just how this may be achieved will become clear as we move on through the book. The accuser of our brethren is cast into the earth, where we can deal with the spirit of rebellion separately by use of will. Satan's influence accused them before our God day and night, quite simply stating the fact that there is set before thee life and good, and death and evil. This accuser is the vibration to which we are susceptible, self, day and night. In the body we find the strength of the Jupiterian influence, which rejects what is risen to consciousness. The forms of our desires bearing the stamps of rebellion. And casts them down into our alchemical retort, the belly, for the remolding of the rebellious satanic influence. So begins our earthly woes, our hell, our troubles and desires in turmoil.
And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, and by the word of their testimony. And they loved not their lives unto the death.
This verse shows the results of the war in consciousness, heaven, as experienced by man's separated awareness. It is well said that there is the seed of destiny within the beginning of any action. In this context we find that the total world as we know it is merely the unfolding of that destiny set by the act of rebellion in mind itself. We would ask when, but, since there is no time as we know it, we must place the question where it belongs, in our own limited and separated concepts. Even though the brain consciousness disregards time. The following quote may help. First, let it be understood there is the pattern in the material, or physical plane of every condition as exists in the cosmic or spiritual plane. For things spiritual and things material are but those same conditions raised to a different condition of the same element. For all forces of one force. Hence the above verse seems to picture the seed of destiny as a universal part of consciousness, setting the tenor of the life of Jesus in the earth. And this was set in heaven, consciousness, before the world was. The unfolding of these universal laws as portrayed in this chapter progresses throughout the rest of the revelation, so that we might come to understand us and learn more of the universal laws, rather than be caught in self's desires. In this verse there is shown the destiny of the spirit of rebellion, as it is to be overcome by the giving of self for others in the blood of the Christ. The followers of the pattern set by Jesus are those who love not their lives unto the death, but who by their actions become the word of their testimony.
Therefore rejoice ye heavens, and ye that dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come down unto you having great wrath, because he knoweth that he hath but a short time.
In verse 9 Satan was cast into the earth, and thus is still here. Yet verse 11 shows Satan overcome by the blood of the Lamb. Now this event did not happen in the beginning, but it was in the destiny, just as are the inhabitants of the earth. Yet the rejoicing shown here is proper for Satan, and his influence is now confined to the earth, and not in mind itself. He can only influence man by reason of or through the earthiness in him. Thus as a now situation, for all time is one time, there is rejoicing in heaven, consciousness, and in all concepts that accept the oneness of all things. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, again relates to the real dwelling place of man. Which is only in consciousness and not in bodies nor on earth. Man as a whole dwells in the consciousness of brain awareness, he identifies with things and his attachments to them, and deals with time and space, as if they were real. It is here that we meet with our rebellions and consequently learn about them through the great wrath of that influence. A question must be asked about the devil in regard to the last part of this verse. Since he knoweth that he hath but a short time, has his consciousness recognized that his understanding, time, will be of no further service to man, once man's consciousness has evolved out of the three-dimensional brain mode of thinking? Or, can it be possible that he knows that he too must return to the Father, just as we must?
And when the dragon saw that he was cast unto the earth, he persecuted the woman which brought forth the man-child.
This statement at face value seems to be similar to reactions we all have when we are brought down from our own high places in life. We too like to take it out on others. In this case, though there is a difference we should note. The dragon began to persecute the woman, and the woman is not a person, but is a principle of creation. The acceptance of responsibility for bringing forth that which is in accord with all creative forces. Thus the dragon does not persecute man, but does persecute or adversely affect the creative forces throughout the earth plane. In this, man too suffers the wrath of Satan, but only indirectly. Satan disturbed the earth plane's creative forces, and man in his use of these disturbed forces in turn suffers the wrath of Satan. In spite of this, however, we copy Satan's actions, and when we are overcome or put down we too blame others, just as did Adam and Eve. Or, even sometimes we even blame the devil and say, "He made me do it." In such instances, both we and Satan are in the same situation. We have not accepted our own responsibility for our created predicaments. This idea may not be acceptable to many, but in this verse and in this whole section, we are studying the universal forces, not just individual concepts. We must eventually find answers which will lead us back to the Father, and this seems to point to that injunction, love one another. Another way to look at the persecution is this. Satan is bound to the earth while the woman is free. This was the cause of his persecution. She was a developing force while he was bound in the earth. If so, then one can understand Satan's great wrath.
And to the woman were given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the face of the serpent.
The readings give us the clue to understanding this verse, however we should also refer to verse 6 above, for the place prepared of God. Since it is again referred to here. What is meant by the symbols of the wings of eagle given to the woman for escape, and the time and times and half a time? This is as the entrance into or the flight from materiality into those influences through which the body may rest within itself, as physical, or the mental flight, or that to the astral forces as about its various changes. It is figurative of the transitions from the various spheres of mental experience, by the mind, the spiritual influences as arise. And are as the use of same. Remember, all of these should be then in accord with that ye have attained to, that the book of life is given thee. What is the book of life? The record of God, of thee, thy soul within and the knowledge of same. This reading states rather clearly the idea of reincarnation. In between lives the entity may and does withdraw within the self, so as to gain an understanding of how it has used the earth's forces in its development. This withdrawal may also be considered a withdrawal from the influence of those earth forces, especially of the elements earth, water, fire and air, which man uses in his creative efforts while in the flesh. In earth life the influences of the spiritual spheres, in Revelation 2 and 3 represented by the angels of the churches, are felt only as urges or are contained in experiences, while in between earth life experiences we experience the influences directly. Just as on earth we pay attention to the outward happenstances, rather than the influences causing the happening. In this withdrawal those planetary influences may be experienced without the mental having to separate out the earth's forces, to gain a knowledge of the unadulterated nature of those same planetary spheres or influences. In earth lives we usually deal with them in an adulterated form. Adulterated by our desires. It may be said that we spend periods in other planes of consciousness, so that we might know the natural forces arising in us without the strife or contention between the spiritual and earthly material natures in us. The essences behind the manifested in earth's activities as opposed to the manifested itself. The wilderness is the unconscious. But it may also be an understanding of the intuitive nature of a woman. She knows and has learned to see the real. The thing behind the thing, the logos or the essence of things. This is an expression of knowledge of a situation without the rationalization of the brain. She has accepted her innate knowing as the guiding influence in her decisions. These unconscious tendencies come from the soul, from the place of acceptance, of living by faith. The nourishment is what we learn about the natures and essences of the unknown in us, the planetary essences as nature's happenings in our lives. Time and times and half a time is found in the very nature of time as a measure of understanding, for time is the measure of understanding of an idea. So that in the interims we are given understandings of ideas only hinted at in the earth experiences, as well as the ability to make spatial evaluations, a brain function, and even to know without knowing. The hunches and certainties expressed by women in Just Because. Here we gain the courage to live by faith, otherwise we would rebel against our very natures and the help available from our active unconscious.
And the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth, and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth.
The serpent, of course, is the rebellious spirit. Being cast out of his mouth refers to the influence, the word. The water is the spirit of rebellion which arises in us. It is the emotions by which we get carried away. The readings have this to say about this verse. Explain: the flood is caused by the serpent to destroy the woman and the help given by the earth. Revelation 12 verses 15 and 16. The flood is the emotions upon the influences of the body in all of its relationships to the activities in its relationships to others, and destroys the baser forces. Aided by the application in the earth, which represents the elements of material manifestations in the experiences of the individual. For, how hath he given? The children of earth are wiser in their generation than the children of light, or from the very growth of what is the experience of the individual in the earth in its seeking for light. Or as he gave in the parable, for impunity's sake or for custom's sake, or for the help that the influence may bring, he will arise and give. So in the experience of the individual, know that there constantly arises within the sojourn in the life or in an experience in the earth, the flood of emotions that make for doubt, fears, tribulation, disturbances, anxieties. For the very sake of that as becometh then impunity, the earth aids in the quieting of the influence as is illustrated here. From this it may be determined just how the earth forces help us quiet the emotions, and especially those aroused by relationships with others. This also should tell us that the universal forces, as experienced by the entity Jesus, carry through to present-day man.
And the dragon was wroth with the woman, and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, which keep the commandments of God, and have the testimony of Jesus Christ.
Here is a splendid reference to the unfoldment of memories inherited or almost innate, which give birth to what we ought to be. The rebellious spirit in us is carried over into our descendants as seed for responses. Our traits and temperaments are carried over, and thus the war with the seed. Our inherent tendencies are implanted by our progenitors, by the ideals and purposes held at the time of conception. These too are propagated in turn by us. Yet there is embedded in the creative forces and memories that which would express the purposes held by the Christ as our Savior from self. These are there from the beginning, as shown in this verse, and are as original purposes of God working through the unadulterated creative forces, which would create us in the image of God. These deeply embedded memories are the testimony of Jesus Christ. That there should be those who should know heaven on earth or in the earth or in flesh is the destiny of those that are willing, who have had their minds, their bodies, their souls cleansed in the blood of the Lamb. How? By being as he, a living example of that he, the Christ, professed to be. And may the grace and the mercy and the peace of a life lived in thine own consciousness be thine through him, that is able to present our lives before the throne of God spotless, white as snow, washed in the blood of the sacrifices made in our own daily experience. Even as he has shown us the way. All hate, all malice, all those things that would make for a detrimental influence, those that would turn aside an eye single or service to an eye single of purpose, in becoming aware of the love that the creative force bears within the experience for each individual, that the will of the Father is that no soul shall perish, but that with each temptation, with each trial, with each test, even as ever, in the present there remains the advocate with the Father, that there may be no harm, no impurity, no darkness at all in the soul, in the desire, in the purpose of those that seek to know his face, to those that follow it even as afar. They, too, as this entity, may purify themselves. Then as in the fires of nature, or in the blood of the Lamb that taketh away the sins of the world. No scorn, no sneer, but with patience, with fortitude, with praise, with the giving of pleasure in music, in kindnesses, in gentle words, in bespeaking of that as may build for a perfect mind, a perfect soul, a perfect body, may the entity overcome those things that have beset that not often understood, those things that so easily beset us, making the will one with the Creator and the creative forces. Be used by them, and the channel. the cup will run over with blessings. Those things that easily beset bespeak not of those only that are weaknesses in the flesh. But the weaknesses in the flesh are the scars of the soul. And these, only in that of making the will one with his, being washed as it were in the blood of the Lamb. Follow well in those paths that are set by the present entity's will, and knowledge of those laws that make the entity secure in the blood of the Lamb, that taketh away the sins of the world. Glory in his name, that the crowning of thy activities, as they join with the powers that he gives to those that join in the song of the Lamb, as they gather about the throne, may be, and the title may be read. Come, thou blessed of those whose robes have been washed in the blood of the Lamb, whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life, whose joys will be in the house of her God. Love thy neighbor as thyself. Do unto others as ye would have others do unto you. For, this being the whole law is applied to man in his relations to his fellow man, makes for the abilities in the experience of every soul to know his ways, to be guided by his that have been washed in the blood of that Lamb. The entity thwarted others and is meeting it in self. That is karma. In the blood of the Christ as was shed karma is met, and then it becomes the law, not of cause and effect, but of being justified by faith in him. Then, may we apply those things of the material earth and the spiritual combination, to become again sons of God. Not sons of Belial or of the devil. He offers, today. If ye will hearken, if ye will but listen, if ye will but begin to apply love, hope, faith, forgiveness, then may ye indeed be washed in the blood of the Lamb that taketh away the sin of the world. Thy body is indeed the temple of the living God. And what does it appear in the present? Broken in purpose, broken in the ability to reproduce itself. What is lacking? That which is life itself, which is of and is the manifestation of that influence or force ye call God, that is God in manifestation. How, why, was there the need for there to be a resurrection? Why came he into the earth to die the death, even on the cross? Has it been, then, the fulfillment of promise, the fulfillment of law, the fulfillment of man's estate? Else why did he put on flesh and come into the earth in the form of man, but to be one with the Father, to show to man man's divinity, man's relationship to the Maker, to show man that indeed the Father meant it when he said, "If ye call I will hear." Even though ye be far away, even though ye be covered with sin, if ye be washed in the blood of the Lamb ye may come back. Then, though he were the first of man, the first of the sons of God in spirit, in flesh, it became necessary that he fulfill all those associations, those connections that were to wipe away in the experience of man that which separates him from his Maker.